On the 25th of December 1989, Elena Ceaușescu ceased to be untouchable. Within a matter of hours, the woman who had ruled alongside her husband ended up defeated on Christmas Day. For years, she was presented as a scientist, leader, and mother of the nation. But she was also accused of abuses, privileges, and blind loyalty to a regime hated by millions. When the power collapsed, she was caught in the same fury she had fueled. Why was the end so violent? What was behind the decision to erase her without delay? How did she go from being publicly revered to being eliminated like an enemy? Humble origins, from illiterate peasant to the threshold of power. On the 25th of December of 1989, in a barracks in Târgoviște, bursts of automatic rifles were heard. In a few seconds, two figures lay motionless on the snow. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu ended a regime and opened a power vacuum in an exhausted country. To understand how that woman came to occupy a central place in one of the most authoritarian governments of Eastern Europe, it is necessary to go back to the early years of her life, when she was still called Elena Petrescu. On the 7th of January 1916, he was born in the small village of Petresti in the region of Dâmbovița, in the south of Romania. His family belonged to the most modest peasantry, dependent on insufficient land and seasonal work. He was the third of 6 children in a home marked by precariousness. His father cultivated plots that barely guaranteed subsistence, and his mother took care of domestic chores and childcare. Elena's childhood took place in a rural backwardness context characteristic of interwar Romania. Education in the villages was deficient, illiteracy affected the majority of the population, and social structures restricted mobility possibilities, especially for women. Under those conditions, Elena did not attend school regularly. She remained illiterate until adolescence, a shortcoming she would later try to conceal through propagandistic means. However, this limitation did not prevent her from developing a persistent ambition to improve her social situation. While her sisters took on the traditional roles of marriage and rural life, she sought to escape a fate marked by rural poverty. This desire for a break led her in the 1930s to move to Bucharest, following the same path as thousands of young people who left the countryside to work in the light industry. She found work as a textile worker in an environment characterized by exhausting hours, low wages, and collective housing in unsanitary conditions. The capital represented for Elena a space of unknown opportunities in her hometown. There she came into contact with clandestine political environments in which the Romanian Communist Party operated, then outlawed and persecuted by the monarchical authorities. The meetings were held in basements, private houses, and factories where forbidden propaganda was distributed. For many workers, communism offered a discourse of social equality that directly addressed the needs of those who had grown up in poverty. There are no exact records about the moment when Elena began to associate with those circles, but by the late 1930s her presence in communist environments was evident. In 1939 she met Nicolae Ceaușescu, a militant 7 years younger who had already gone through arrests and imprisonments due to his political activity. The relationship emerged in a context of clandestinity, where political trust was as important as personal affinity. The union of both was from the beginning more than a sentimental bond. Elena recognized in Nicolae a young man with potential within the party structure, while he valued the determination and ambition she brought. The Second World War reinforced that alliance. During the regime of Marshal Ion Antonescu, ally of Germany, communism remained in illegality. Nicolae was detained on several occasions and came into contact with cadres who would later occupy key positions in the party. Elena, although without political prominence, remained close to the militancy and consolidated her role as a constant companion. The landscape changed in 1944 with the entry of the Red Army into Romania and the fall of Antonescu. The Communist Party, until then a minority, acquired a decisive position thanks to Soviet backing. Nicolae was freed and began to rise rapidly in the communist hierarchy, in a process marked by the need to recruit young leaders loyal to Moscow. Elena accompanied that evolution, always maintaining a close tie with the party structure. In the final years of the decade of 1940, Elena tried to improve her personal profile. She enrolled in technical and vocational training courses, although with limited results. The lack of a solid academic foundation was a weakness she sought to compensate for through proximity to power and later through propaganda, mechanisms aimed at building an image of intellectual prestige. The marriage between Elena and Nicolae took place in 1947, a crucial year for the history of Romania. King Michael I was forced to abdicate under Soviet pressure, and the People's Republic was proclaimed. The Communist Party, with direct backing from Moscow, took full control of the state and eliminated any remnants of political opposition. The new marriage found in that context an ideal platform to project their ambitions. Nicolae received positions within the administrative and military structure of the party, while Elena presented herself as a life and militant partner. The relationship was consolidated as a political association aimed at taking advantage of the opportunities offered by the socialist regime under construction. What had begun as a union in secrecy was now transforming into a shared project of power, whose consequences would mark the direction of Romania during the following decades. The forged myth, the wife, turned into an emblem of the regime. After her marriage in 1947, Elena Ceaușescu began to approach the political life of the new Romanian state more directly. The Communist Party had consolidated its dominance with the support of the Soviet Union and with the definitive disappearance of the monarchy. Nicolae Ceaușescu, still a young leader, held intermediate-level administrative and military functions, although he was already perceived as a figure with potential for greater power. Elena was officially presented as an exemplary wife of a communist militant, without holding significant positions within the state administration. However, since the late 1940s, she began a discreet but systematic image-building process, supported by both her own aspirations and the expanding propaganda apparatus. In the official narrative, she appeared as a symbol of the new socialist woman, from illiterate peasant to a citizen committed to the revolution. This portrayal was functional to the party's discourse, which sought to show its leaders as embodiments of social transformation. During the 1950s, her role in the administration remained marginal, while Nicolae advanced rapidly in the party hierarchy. However, during that period, the foundations were laid for what would later be her artificial prestige. A key element was the gradual fabrication of academic credentials. In 1957, she joined as a technician at the Chemical Research Institute in Bucharest, a position obtained thanks to her political affiliation. From there, a carefully directed process began to provide her with titles and recognitions. In 1964, she received a high school diploma under exceptional circumstances, with exams organized under the direct supervision of the party. Shortly thereafter, she began studies at the Polytechnic Institute of Bucharest and in 1967 was proclaimed a chemical engineer despite the obvious limitations in her actual training. Official propaganda amplified this achievement, presenting her as an outstanding scientist. Her name began to appear associated with research in the field of polymers and publications in academic journals, although specialists agree that her actual participation was minimal. The propaganda strategy was not limited to local titles. During the 1960s, it accumulated distinctions from foreign universities, especially in socialist countries and in non-aligned states with which Romania maintained trade relations. These recognitions, diplomatically managed, sought to consolidate the image of a leader with international prestige. In parallel, the internal media began to project her as the symbolic mother of the nation. Reports in factories, schools, and research centers showed her as a leader concerned about youth and cultural development. This discourse constructed an ideal of a working woman and exemplary mother, in line with the party's policy of massively integrating women into productive and political life. His dealings with intellectuals and officials revealed from an early stage an authoritarian style. At the Institute of Chemistry, where he wielded nominal authority, he imposed decisions on technical matters that he did not master. Any objection, no matter how minimal, could lead to sanctions or professional exclusion. This conduct anticipated the pattern that would later characterize his management in the entire state apparatus: authority exercised through political power, not specialized knowledge. The relationship with Nicolae was also strengthened on the political front. Although her role continued to appear secondary, her influence on decisions was increasingly noticeable. Later testimonies indicated that Nicolae regularly consulted with her before adopting important measures, and that her judgment was decisive in appointments and dismissals. At official ceremonies, Elena behaved with increasing prominence, which created friction with other leaders and their wives, accustomed to a more rigid protocol. In 1965, after the death of Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, Nicolae was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the same time, Elena's image changed. From companion, she went on to be presented as a comrade in arms. The propaganda insisted on showing both as an inseparable couple, symbol of national unity under communist leadership. In the 1970s, this process reached a culminating point. Elena began to hold high-level positions within the state structure. In 1972, she was appointed a member of the Central Committee, and in 1973, she joined the Executive Committee, the highest power core in Romania. With these appointments, her influence ceased to be exclusively indirect and transformed into formal institutional power. Between 1972 and 1974, her figure was definitively consolidated as a top leader. The propaganda intensified her presence, presenting her as a scientist, exemplary mother, and political leader with concrete responsibilities in education, science, and culture. Although her real authority still depended more on the propaganda machinery than on technical skills, the institutional control she had achieved allowed her to participate in the central decisions of the state. From then on, Elena ceased to occupy a subordinate position to Nicolae and became part of the ruling core of the regime. Her personal rise coincided with the moment when the personality cult of both reached a structural level, transforming the political and social life of Romania. Iron Reign, decades of control over the nation. In 1974, Elena Ceaușescu was proclaimed President of the Socialist Republic of Romania. The position reinforced the supremacy he had already exercised since his election as General Secretary of the Communist Party. With this institutionalization of power, Elena Ceaușescu consolidated her position as a central figure in the political life of the country. From then on, the couple projected a joint leadership, with him as head of state and her as a leading political and scientific figure. In 1980, Elena was named the first Deputy Prime Minister of Romania, a title that formalized a power she already exercised in practice. No relevant decision was made without her approval, and key ministries such as education, research, youth, and social affairs operated under her direct supervision. Teachers, scientists, and intellectuals knew that any deviation from the ideological line could lead to severe sanctions, from dismissal to arrest. In the second half of the 1970s, the country accessed loans from Western financial institutions and foreign governments to finance massive industrialization projects. Large industrial and agricultural complexes were constructed with the intention of transforming the economy into a self-sufficient model. However, the magnitude of these investments generated considerable external debt, worsened after the world energy crisis of 1979. Faced with the financial threat, Ceaușescu decided to settle the debt as quickly as possible, implementing an extreme austerity policy that subordinated daily life to the goal of paying international creditors. The strategy was to maximize exports and minimize domestic consumption. Food, oil, raw materials, and manufactured products were almost entirely destined for external markets. The immediate result was the establishment of a rationing system that affected the entire population. From 1981, each citizen received coupons that strictly limited the amount of bread, milk, meat, oil, or sugar that they could purchase. Access to basic products became an exhausting task, marked by endless queues in front of shops and the uncertainty of returning home empty-handed. In the cities, the diet of a large part of the population was reduced to bread, potatoes, fermented cabbage, and low-quality food. Meat disappeared from butcher shops for long periods, and dairy products became unattainable for most. The deterioration in food led to increasing rates of malnutrition, anemia, and diseases associated with nutritional deficiencies. Electricity and heating were also subject to severe restrictions. Starting in 1982, scheduled blackouts were imposed and domestic consumption was reduced to a few hours daily. Homes rarely exceeded 14 degrees in winter, and in schools and offices it was common for workers and students to remain bundled up indoors. Public lighting was minimized, plunging cities into semi-darkness. Hospitals were affected by the chronic lack of medicine and basic equipment. Antibiotics, painkillers, and surgical materials were scarce. Many interventions were carried out in precarious conditions, with unheated rooms and insufficient rations for patients. Subsequent reports reflected significant increases in infant mortality and diseases associated with malnutrition. The impact of the pro-natalist policy imposed since 1966 with the prohibition of abortion and contraceptives became strongly evident in this decade. Many families unable to support their children turned to orphanages, institutions that were overloaded and had minimal resources. Thousands of children grew up in conditions of neglect, with physical and health consequences that would become visible after the fall of the regime. Meanwhile, the contrast between the life of the population and the lifestyle of the ruling elite was evident. The Ceaușescu family enjoyed residences with permanent heating, access to imported products and luxuries unattainable for the majority. Tropical fruits, quality coffee, chocolate, and select meats were available on their table, while the population struggled to obtain bread or milk. Elena accumulated haute couture clothing, jewelry, and luxury items, reinforcing the perception of an insurmountable gap between leaders and citizens. The official propaganda concealed these differences, but rumors about the privilege of the elite circulated widely. Workers who occasionally accessed the presidential residences described scenes of abundance that contrasted with the general hardship. On the streets, the queues in front of the shops became a permanent feature of the urban landscape. Entire families took turns waiting for hours, often without knowing what product would be available. The population developed informal networks to share information on supply deliveries, creating a constant dynamic of expectations and frustrations. The time spent obtaining basic food items was enormous and affected work productivity, in addition to exhausting everyday life. In the industrial sector, factories had to meet unrealistic quotas with shortages of raw materials and frequent power cuts. The quality of production decreased, but much of what was manufactured was forcibly exported, further reducing domestic availability. Official speeches insisted that sacrifices were necessary to ensure national independence and pay off foreign debt, while the standard of living fell 2 levels of mere subsistence. By the end of the 1980s, the regime had managed to drastically reduce its external debt. However, the price was an internal crisis that irreversibly marked the lives of millions of Romanians. Material deprivation, political repression, and relentless propaganda defined a period in which daily survival became the main concern of the entire society. The apparatus of fear, Securitate's shadow. In the last years of the 1980s, Romania had significantly reduced its external debt, but the social cost had been devastating. The population suffered from extreme shortages and a crumbling infrastructure, while facing one of the most penetrating systems of social control in Eastern Europe. Economic misery coexisted with a repressive apparatus that ensured the regime's permanence. The Securitate, created in 1948 with Soviet advice, quickly consolidated itself as the nucleus of the coercive power of the state. Officially defined as the Department of State Security, its declared function was to ensure political stability, but in practice it transformed into an organization of surveillance and punishment that reached all aspects of daily life. Initially directed by Alexandru Dragici and later by Tudor Postelnicu, it adapted control techniques inspired by Soviet experience but adjusted to local conditions. In a country of just over 20 million inhabitants, hundreds of thousands of people acted as agents, collaborators, or informants. Social espionage was exercised in factories, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Phones were routinely tapped, letters were opened, and homes could harbor secretly installed microphones. Permanent surveillance created an atmosphere of suspicion that penetrated even families, where parents warned their children to avoid repeating in public what was heard at home. The regime relied on denunciation as a control mechanism. Informing on neighbors, co-workers, or even relatives could mean few but valuable privileges in a context of scarcity, better housing, promotions, or access to additional rations. Refusing to collaborate implied the risk of exclusion, persecution, or detention. The consequence was a society fragmented by mutual distrust in which no one was completely sure of their environment. The repression was not limited to psychological surveillance. Since the 1950s, the prisons of Pitești, Aiud, Gherla, or Râmnicu Sărat were scenes of prolonged imprisonments. There, former monarchist officers, peasants who resisted collectivization, critical intellectuals, protesting workers, and young people accused of listening to foreign broadcasts were detained. Interrogation techniques included prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, systematic beatings, and humiliations designed to break the will. The so-called Pitesti experiment between 1949 and 1952 became an extreme example of institutionalized violence. Over the decades, the forms of repression became more sophisticated. Threats against family members, arbitrary dismissals, and university expulsions were added to the detentions. Disappearances and clandestine detention centers fostered a constant fear, reinforced by the absence of information in media completely controlled by the state. Elena Ceaușescu's role in this apparatus was not decorative. From her position on the executive committee of the party, she intervened in appointments and dismissals within the Securitate and directly pressured political purges. Universities, research institutes, and cultural organizations operated under her supervision, leading to selective expulsions and arrests of academics and students. Internal reports show that she demanded the constant purging of cadres accused of disloyalty, which affected not only those involved but also their families, who were systematically marginalized from social and professional life. Subsequent investigations revealed that the regime sponsored clandestine medical projects involving prisoners and orphans. Trials with vaccines, medications, and chemical compounds were conducted without consent or safety guarantees. The orphanages, saturated by the natalist policy and the economic crisis, served as a base for these practices. Later reports indicate that Elena, officially linked to chemical and pharmaceutical research, knew of and endorsed these initiatives in the name of national scientific development. The combination of mass surveillance, physical repression, and ideological control turned the Securitate into the central pillar of the dictatorship. The direct influence of Elena Ceaușescu on the functioning of the apparatus reinforced the regime's ability to sustain itself for decades at the price of a society subjected to a constant fear that permeated daily life. That fear persisted until the last months of 1989, when the system began to show the first visible cracks. Revolution in flames, the regime collapses under. The regime of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu had endured for decades thanks to a combination of repression, propaganda, and isolation. By the end of 1989, however, that structure was weakened by economic misery and by a repressive apparatus that no longer managed to intimidate the entire population. Romania was the last country in the European socialist bloc where the dictatorship remained intact, and it was also the only one where the transition ended violently. The trigger occurred on the 16th of December in the city of Timișoara, in the west of the country. The order to evict the reformed pastor Laszlo Tokes, accused of criticizing the regime, generated an immediate mobilization of his parishioners. Within a few hours, hundreds of neighbors joined the resistance, and in the following days, thousands of people took to the streets. The protest ceased to be a local issue and became an open political demonstration against the government. The response was the deployment of army troops and the Securitate, which repressed with increasing violence. On the 17th and 18th of December, the security forces opened fire on the crowd. The victims numbered in the hundreds. The regime tried to hide the magnitude of the massacre. The bodies of the deceased were removed from the hospitals in Timișoara and clandestinely transported to Bucharest, where they were hastily cremated in state-controlled crematoria. The operation, later known as the Incinerator Action, sought to erase all evidence of the repression. However, the information quickly leaked through rumors, testimonies from relatives, and foreign radio broadcasts. The impact was immediate. The outrage spread throughout the country. In Bucharest, the atmosphere was tense. The population already knew what had happened in Timișoara and began to openly defy official slogans. Even so, on the 21st of December, Nicolae Ceaușescu organized a rally in Republic Square with the intention of showing that he retained popular support. Thousands of workers were forced to attend, following the usual procedure of forced mobilization. The state television broadcast the event live. During the first few minutes, Ceaușescu spoke in the usual tone, praising the achievements of socialism and denouncing supposed foreign agents as responsible for the disturbances. But soon shouts and boos began to be heard in the crowd. The transmission was immediately interrupted, although millions of viewers had already seen how the figure of the dictator was publicly challenged. The myth of total obedience was broken live in front of the whole country. That same night, violent clashes erupted in Bucharest. The protesters set up improvised barricades and clashed with the police and the army. Fires broke out in public buildings and there was continuous gunfire in several areas of the capital. The number of casualties grew rapidly. On the morning of the 22nd of December, the regime received a decisive blow. The Minister of Defense, Vasile Milea, died under unexplained circumstances. The official version spoke of suicide, although numerous later testimonies suggested that he was murdered after refusing to order a mass repression. The news triggered the collapse of the chain of command. Many army units refused to continue firing at civilians and began to join the protesters. Around the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party gathered a crowd demanding the resignation of the dictator. Inside, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu met with their closest collaborators to evaluate options that were already narrowing down to fleeing. At noon, the couple appeared on the building's balcony. They tried to address the crowd, but the hostile shouts prevented any communication. Minutes later, they were evacuated to the rooftop, where a military helicopter was waiting for them to escape. The flight first took them to Snagov and then to the Titu region, but the airspace was under military control and the movements were intercepted. The pilot decided to land on the outskirts, where the Ceaușescus continued by road in requisitioned vehicles. The journey did not last long. They were identified by the population and detained by a military unit in the locality of Boteni. The capture of the couple marked the end of their status as supreme leaders. Turned into prisoners, they were transferred to the military barracks of Targovist. Spaces for custody were improvised there under strict surveillance. The presence of the Ceaușescu in the hands of the army generated concern. There was a fear that they could still be rescued by loyal groups or used as symbols to reorganize the resistance. Meanwhile, in Bucharest, the National Salvation Front was formed, composed of former party members led by Ion Iliescu. This body assumed political power amidst sporadic gunfire and a chaotic situation. There was talk of unknown snipers who continued firing at the population, whom the new authority labeled as terrorists loyal to the dictator. To this day, there is no consensus on who they really were. The new government understood that the situation was extremely fragile. As long as Nicolae and Elena remained alive, the possibility of a counterattack or an attempt at reorganization was still present. Each day that passed increased the risk of a military rescue or a prolonged conflict. For this reason, the decision was made to expedite the procedures and provide an immediate solution to the crisis. In the barracks of Targovist, the Ceaușescus were permanently watched by armed soldiers. Military discipline guaranteed their custody, but the atmosphere was one of constant uncertainty. The tension between the need to keep them alive and the pressure to resolve their fate definitively was becoming increasingly evident. The entire country had gone in a matter of days from forced obedience to an outburst of uncontrolled violence, and the immediate future remained in absolute uncertainty. Trial in 1 hour, swift judgment. On the morning of the 25th of December of 1989, at the military barracks in Targovist, an exceptional tribunal was improvised to judge Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. The decision was not the product of a carefully elaborated legal calculation, but of an immediate political and military urgency. The capital remained engulfed in clashes, the chain of command was fractured, and constant rumors circulated that armed groups loyal to the regime could attempt a rescue. In that context, the National Salvation Front resolved that the only way to stabilize the situation was to impose a quick and definitive sentence. The tribunal was composed of military officers converted into judges for the occasion. Magistrate Ghica Popa was appointed president of the court, accompanied by 2 other officers as associate judges. The prosecution was handled by Dan Voinea, while 2 civilian lawyers, Nicolae Teodorescu and Constantine Lucescu, were appointed as public defenders. None of them had a real chance to prepare the case. The procedure was designed as a brief process that was supposed to produce an unappealable conviction. The chosen room was a common area of the barracks, equipped with ordinary tables and chairs. The austerity of the space reflected the improvised nature of the trial. There were no public, No journalists, no official record beyond some video recordings to document the event. In the room, only the defendants, the members of the tribunal, the defenders, the prosecutor, and a strong military unit in charge of custody remained. The weather outside the headquarters was no less tense. In Bucharest, sporadic shootings continued and the population still did not know the fate of the ruling couple. The propaganda of the new power spoke of terrorists still active, which reinforced the perception of imminent danger. All this gave the trial an extraordinary sense of urgency. Dan Voinia opened the session with the reading of the charges. The accusation was summarized in 4 main sections. The first was genocide, based on a number of tens of thousands of deaths attributed to the regime by systematic repression and by the recent massacres in Timisoara and Bucharest. The second charge was the deliberate destruction of the economy, linked to the accelerated payment plan of the external debt that had generated hunger, shortages, and widespread deprivation. The third was illicit enrichment for the diversion of state resources towards accounts and luxury goods abroad. The fourth focused on an attack against the state for ordering to shoot at civilians and for attempting to divide the army in full crisis. The accusations were read quickly, without extensive documentary evidence or eyewitnesses. The procedure, which in an ordinary context would have required months of instruction, was reduced to categorical statements. The brevity of the plea reflected that the central objective was not a thorough judicial examination, but to establish a formal basis for the conviction. The role of the defense was marginal. One of the lawyers attempted to introduce the idea of partial incapacity, suggesting that Nicolae did not fully understand the situation. The proposal was immediately rejected. Elena interrupted with insults directed at the defenders themselves, refusing to accept any argument other than the full claim of her legitimacy. The reactions of the accused marked the development of the trial. Nicolae appeared apathetic, mechanically repeating that he remained the legitimate president of the Socialist Republic of Romania. He insisted that he only recognized the authority of the working people and that the court lacked a legal basis. His words were confusing, with constant references to foreign conspiracies and internal betrayals. Elena, in contrast, adopted a defiant attitude. She interrupted with shouts, labeled each charge as lies, and accused judges and prosecutors of being traitors. The session was chaotic. The court's attempts to maintain formality were insufficient in the face of interruptions and the political tension of the moment. There was no possibility of a real debate on evidence or responsibilities. Essentially, the trial was a political formality. Toward mid-afternoon, the sentence was pronounced. The Ceaușescus were declared guilty of all charges and sentenced to death by immediate execution. The decision was justified on 3 points: the severity of the crimes attributed, the risk of military rescue, and the political necessity of showing the country and the world that the communist regime had ended with no possibility of return. The reaction of the accused did not alter the outcome. Nicolae reiterated that he was the constitutional president and that the court was illegitimate. Elena hurled insults and refused to sign documents related to the process. The reading of the sentence officially closed a trial that had lasted less than 1 hour, becoming one of the briefest and most significant processes in the contemporary history of Eastern Europe. Once the session concluded, the military personnel responsible for custody received the order to proceed with the execution. Outside, the situation continued to be marked by confusion and sporadic clashes. Inside the barracks, the immediate future of the accused was already sealed. The trial had left no room for appeals or higher bodies. The final resolution was made, and what followed would be the final phase of a regime extinguishing within a matter of hours. The Grey Wall, the instant of the execution. The summary trial had concluded without appeals or higher instances, and the death sentence pronounced in Târgoviște had to be executed immediately. Just minutes after the verdict, the military responsible for custody received the order to move Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu to the courtyard of the barracks to proceed with their execution. The decision responded to the direct pressure of the situation. Keeping them alive was perceived as a strategic risk in a country where there was still talk of loyal armed groups and a possible rescue attempt. The journey from the makeshift courtroom to the courtyard was short, but it was filled with tension. The soldiers escorted the accused through narrow corridors and open areas in the cold December air. Nicolae moved slowly, muttering incoherent phrases about his legitimacy as president and scattered references to scientific socialism. Elena actively resisted, insulting the officers and repeatedly saying that they were traitors to the socialist fatherland. Her behavior contrasted with the restrained silence of the soldiers who carried out the order with strict discipline. In the yard awaited the firing squad, composed of 8 paratroopers selected from among dozens of volunteers. The choice of young soldiers trained in combat responded to the need to ensure quickness and effectiveness. The automatic rifles were loaded and the condemned were placed in front of a grey wall of the barracks. There was no ceremony or prolonged protocols. They were offered to blindfold the accused, but Elena firmly rejected it. She shouted that she wanted to look her executioners in the eyes and added direct insults against the soldiers. Nikolai was not blindfolded either. In the final moments, Nikolai intoned fragments of a communist hymn with a weak voice. Elena continued hurling insults and curses, directing her words both at the squad and the new government in Bucharest. The couple faced death with divergent attitudes. He took refuge in a broken ideological discourse, she expressing open hostility until the last moment. The officer in command gave the order to fire. The volley was immediate and close. The automatic rifles fired in unison, creating a roar that echoed throughout the barracks. In a matter of seconds, dozens of projectiles struck the bodies of Nikolai and Elena, who fell simultaneously to the ground with no chance of survival. The violence of the automatic fire was such that there was no need for additional shots. The forcefulness of the procedure reflected both military discipline and the political intention to eliminate any uncertainty. For many of the soldiers, participating in the execution represented a symbolic act. They had grown up under the regime and now contributed to closing a historical cycle. The intensity of the fire also responded to the mix of obedience and emotions accumulated after years of deprivation and repression. The execution was recorded with portable cameras placed at different points of the barracks. The decision to record the entire process followed a propagandistic logic to have irrefutable audiovisual evidence to show the country and the world that the dictatorship had ended definitively. The images captured the transfer of the accused, the preparation of the squad, and, albeit fragmentarily, the exact moment of the volley. The harshness of the shooting made it difficult to get a clear record of every detail, but the recordings were enough to document the effective death of the Ceaușescus. The following morning, the 26th of December, Romanian television broadcast the images to the entire population. It was the first time that millions of citizens saw an audio-visual material without propaganda filters about their leaders. The internal reaction was immediate. For a large part of the population, the images conclusively confirmed that the regime had disappeared. For years, the Ceaușescus had been presented as untouchable figures, surrounded by a constant cult of personality. Seeing their bodies fallen in a military courtyard symbolized the end of fear and the propaganda apparatus that had dominated daily life. The images were repeated in multiple broadcasts throughout the day, reinforcing the feeling of definitive break. The emotional impact was profound. The majority of the citizens experienced relief and a sense of liberation. However, there was also bewilderment and debate. The summary judgment and the swiftness of the execution generated immediate questions in intellectual and legal circles. The lack of a thorough process, the absence of documented evidence, and the almost instantaneous execution fueled discussions about the legitimacy of what occurred. Although the end of the dictatorship was celebrated, the manner in which it happened left an ambivalent mark on the collective memory. The international dimension was equally significant. In Western Europe and the United States, the media highlighted the contrast between the summary execution in Romania and the peaceful transitions in Poland, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia. The front pages showed images of the shooting and questioned the lack of procedural safeguards. However, many governments also officially expressed satisfaction at the end of a dictatorship perceived as one of the most repressive of the socialist bloc. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union avoided openly condemning the execution, although it distanced itself from the methods used. In Beijing and Pyongyang, the authorities remained silent, interpreting the images as a warning of the risks of losing control over the population. In the neighboring Eastern European countries, the images were seen as the inevitable outcome of a regime that had remained isolated even within the socialist bloc. The recordings became one of the most influential audiovisual documents of the late 20th century. Their international dissemination symbolized not only the end of a particular dictatorship, but also the closing of a historical cycle in Eastern Europe. The rawness of the material, broadcast without extensive edits, contrasted with decades of propaganda that had portrayed the Ceaușescu as exemplary leaders. The distance between that official image and the reality of the fallen bodies graphically illustrated the complete collapse of a political system. The impact of the images was immediate, but it also raised long-term questions. Romanian intellectuals and jurists pointed out that the speed of the process could weaken the legitimacy of the new power. At the same time, the authorities of the National Salvation Front defended the decision as necessary to avoid greater bloodshed and ensure stability. The debate about the legitimacy of the trial and execution would accompany the country's democratic transition for years. The fall of the Ceaușescu regime had been condensed into a few minutes of recording. The images of Târgoviște became a symbol of an abrupt end, in contrast to the negotiated processes that marked the transformation of other socialist states. In Romania, the 1989 revolution would always be remembered associated with those video sequences. The desperate escape, the summary trial, and the execution by firing squad. The country was entering a new stage of transition marked by uncertainties, with a new power seeking to legitimize itself amid the chaos. But in the collective memory, what remained most strongly etched was the moment when the myth constructed over decades collapsed in front of the cameras, leaving open the task of rebuilding a state on the ruins of the dictatorship. Why were they executed in that way? Justice or vengeance? The media impact of the images summarized the violent transition from a subdued Romania to a Romania that, with all its future contradictions, sought to free itself definitively from its repressive past. The central question remains, why Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were executed in that specific manner, with that speed, that brutality, and that total lack of consideration. The execution on December 25, 1989 was not only the administrative end of a dictatorship. It constituted an act charged with multiple meanings, designed as an immediate political decision, accumulated social relief, and a symbolic rite of national purification. The absence of a real judicial process, the forcefulness of the squad, and the immediate dissemination of the images responded to a combination of political, social, and cultural factors that exceeded the simple application of revolutionary justice. The fear of the new power was the most immediate factor. The National Salvation Front, which took control after the collapse of the regime, was largely made up of former communist cadres who had broken with Ceaușescu. Their legitimacy was fragile. They had to demonstrate that they represented a genuine change while keeping the state structure functioning. In that context of uncertain transition, keeping Nicolae and Elena alive meant maintaining a potential foothold for loyal forces that could still reorganize. The rumors of counterattacks and terrorist attacks circulated constantly in the days following the couple's escape from Bucharest. Although their existence was never proven on the scale that was announced, the perception of threat was real. The army was divided in its loyalty, the Securitate was still partially operational, and thousands of weapons remained out of control. For the leaders of the front, prolonging the life of the Ceaușescu meant opening the door to a prolonged civil war or a spectacular rescue that would undermine the new power. The summary judgment and immediate execution responded to that strategic urgency. By eliminating them definitively, any possibility of them being used as symbols of alternative legitimacy or as banners of resistance was closed off. The execution was, in that sense, less a judicial act than a preventive measure of a military and political nature. The extreme speed with which the sentence was carried out sought to neutralize any risk before the post-revolutionary chaos turned into an even broader conflict. But the violence of the end cannot be understood only as political calculation. The specific brutality of the execution was marked by revenge accumulated over decades of repression. The population had been subjected to planned hunger, omnipresent surveillance, and constant humiliations. Daily life was characterized by endless lines for basic foods, cold homes in the harshest winters, fear of speaking in public, and distrust towards their own relatives who could inform the Securitate. That collective suffering lacked legal or public channels of expression. For more than 20 years, censorship and repression forced the discontent to remain silent. In December of 1989, with the protests in Timișoara, the interrupted rally in Bucharest, and the armed clashes in the streets, that silence was explosively broken. The execution of the Ceaușescus was understood as the historical reckoning against those who had embodied the national oppression. The fact that dozens of soldiers volunteered to be part of the firing squad shows the extent of that vindictive impulse. Shooting at them was equivalent to directly participating in the symbolic reparation of years of suffering. The massive discharge of more than 100 projectiles in a few seconds can be interpreted as a deliberate gesture of excess. It was not enough to kill them, it was necessary to physically erase them as symbols of a regime that had marked everyone's life. The figure of Elena Ceaușescu accentuated that perception. Nicolae was seen as the leader of the regime, but Elena became the most hated representation of arrogance and corruption. Her falsified academic credentials, her despotic treatment of ministers and scientists, and her involvement in internal purges made her the object of visceral rejection. During the trial, her behavior reinforced that image. She interrupted, insulted, and denied all responsibility. For millions of citizens, she ceased to be perceived as a person and became a concentrated symbol of cruelty and falsehood. The brutality directed against her responded to that process of collective dehumanization. Her elimination was understood as an indispensable requirement to eradicate the regime. The rejection of Elena surpassed the political logic and became a visceral hostility built over years, fueled by official propaganda and abusive power practices. Subsequent historiography has raised the question of whether the execution was a legitimate act of historical justice or a legalized lynching. From a strictly legal perspective, the process violated all basic guarantees. There was no presentation of evidence, the defense was inoperative, the judges lacked impartiality, and the sentence was decided beforehand. Under those parameters, it was a political execution wrapped in minimal legality. However, for others, given the specific circumstances, the summary execution was the only possible way out. The country was on the brink of collapse, with thousands of dead in the streets, and prolonging the trial could multiply the violence. In that context, the speed of the process was seen as a necessary mechanism to close the crisis and send an immediate message of control. The paradox of the episode lies in that it was simultaneously a necessary act to stabilize the country and a flagrant violation of due process. That ambivalence explains why the execution remains a subject of debate. Justice for some, lynching for others. Beyond the legal and the political, the execution fulfilled a symbolic function of collective catharsis. The televised images of the slain bodies represented for millions of Romanians the definitive closure of a stage of fear and suffering. It was not only about the fall of a regime, but about the visible destruction of the figures that had dominated daily life for more than 2 decades. The brutality of the shooting was understood as a ritual of purification, to eliminate the enemy, publicly show their vulnerability, and reaffirm that power had changed hands. The television, which for years had been an instrument of propaganda for the regime, became the vehicle of its collapse. The broadcast of the images transformed the medium into a stage of symbolic inversion, from the cult of personality to the graphic representation of its end. That transmission reinforced the character of a political ritual of the foundation of a new stage. The historical legacy of the execution is complex. It allowed the National Salvation Front to consolidate itself as a guarantor of the end of the regime, but it also left a wound in the collective memory. Democracy was born out of an act of summary justice that raised questions about the methods employed. This paradox remains in the Romanian historical debate. The execution was at the same time a foundational act of the new Romania and an extreme example of revolutionary justice lacking guarantees. The end of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was singular in the European history of the 20th century. No other communist leader from Eastern Europe was executed during the revolutions of 1989. In Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, the transitions were resolved through pacts or peaceful collapses. Only in Romania was the fall sealed with televised blood, transforming the transition into a media spectacle that combined revolutionary justice, popular revenge, and a national purification rite. The regime had been more rigid, more isolated, and more repressive than those of neighboring countries. The accumulation of economic misery and political fear generated a deep hatred that could not be resolved through negotiations or exiles. The violence of the end was proportional to the daily violence that preceded it. The execution was not an accident or an isolated excess, but a logical culmination of a system structurally based on brutality against its own population.